Welcome to NAPCAN's 7th webinar in our National Child Protection Week series, Children and Young People's Rights and Participation. My name's Leesa. I am the Deputy CEO at NAPCAN and part of a small team coordinating National Child Protection Week each year. This year is the 30th anniversary of National Child Protection Week, and I'm really glad that so many of you could join us and be part of this conversation today. I would like to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the beautiful land where I am today. I'm in Canberra. I would like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would like to acknowledge all the elders past, present and emerging from all the lands that you might be watching today, and welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are logged on to the webinar today. It's also really important to acknowledge the children because that's what this week is all about. And that's where culture will live on. A bit of housekeeping now. If you're like me, you're going to be paranoid that that you'll unmute yourself or that you'll appear on the screen. You can't do that. You're in listen-only function, and there's no way that you can do that. So you can sit back and relax. If you have any technical issues, you can. If you look down on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a on the Go To webinar, there is a control panel on the right hand of your screen, and there will be contact details for NAPCAN staff and email addresses if you've got any technical issues. The chat function, the questions chat function has been enabled for questions. We've got a lot of people online today, and we're really hoping that this webinar will be led by questions from the audience. So please send them through. This is a great opportunity for you to be able to ask Liana and Jodie questions directly. The webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on our website and also sent out to you in due course. This year's National Child Protection Week theme, Putting Children First, recognises that the year has been really challenging for many, especially our friends and family and colleagues in Victoria. It's important that in the midst of all of this, we remember to put children first. What we do now has an impact on how children will develop in both the short and long term. When National Child Protection Week started in 1990, I'm sure none of us could have really imagined it looking quite like this in 30 years' time. But on the upside of this online format and this online world, we are accessing a much broader group of people, and a lot more people can be here today. And that's what National Child Protection Week is all about. It's about getting the message out that everybody has a role to play in protecting children and putting children first, not just this week, but every day. So I'm really excited to be facilitating this session on children and young people's rights and participation. It's very close to my heart. Whilst I'm disappointed that the New South Wales Advocate for Children and Young People, Zoe Robinson, was unable to join us at the last minute, I assure you there will be plenty of great discussions with Liana and Jodie. Liana and Jodie are the first of our Commissioners' webinars today. As a collective, the Commissioners and Guardians bring incredible insight into the needs of children and young people. As a group, they are truly a powerful force for promoting, protecting, safety and wellbeing and rights of children. I will start by introducing Jodie Griffiths-Cook. She's the Children's Commissioner for the ACT. As a psychologist, Jodie began her career with 8 years in frontline service delivery before gaining extensive experience in policy development, project management, program design, and practice improvement across various government and non-government leadership roles. This culminated in her appointment as the ACT Public Advocate and Children and Young Persons Commissioner in 2016. Jodie says that one of the best things about being the Commissioner is talking to children and young people and finding out the things that really matter for them and what they think about issues that affect them. Jodie will now provide us with a 5-minute overview of what her role is as Commissioner in the ACT and her priorities. Over to you, Jodie.
Thanks, Leesa. Daranuna, Daranunavo, Yangu Golanyan Nalawiri, Dunan Nunavo Dara, Wangarilliginin, Marin Balan Bugrabang. I've started today with an acknowledgement in the language of the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm standing. It means this is Ngunnawal country. Today we're meeting together on this Ngunnawal country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders. I also acknowledge the lands from which each of you are watching today, pay my respects to all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us, and give recognition to the centrality of your culture in giving strength and meaning to the lives of your children and young people. Fittingly, perhaps, I thought I'd start with a quote from Jackie Huggins, an Aboriginal Australian author and an Aboriginal rights activist, and someone who I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, would know, who said, "It's a very Aboriginal thing to do, to give younger people greater responsibilities within the community as they become able to take those responsibilities on. It's a culturally appropriate transfer of roles that involves respect in both directions, from the younger to the older and the older to the younger." The enactment of children's rights similarly hinges on the mutuality of respect. Although the Convention on the Rights of the Child was written in an era when, arguably, protection was perhaps seen as separate from and independent of participation, we're now in a place where we recognise and where research supports the important role that participation plays in the protection of children and young people. In my view, at the heart of this year's National Child Protection Week theme of putting children first is the important connection between participation and protection and the role that this plays in upholding children's rights. As Children and Young People Commissioner, I have the privilege of spending time with children and young people and finding out things that are important to them in their lives. My primary focus as Commissioner is to position the ACT as a child-safe, child-friendly city. For me, this means promoting and advocating for the importance of all children and young people being empowered to directly participate in decision-making about issues impacting their lives. A key point that we emphasise when engaging with children and young people is that they are the experts in their own lives, which is of course true for all of us, though we rarely think about our lives in this way. Nor do we think often enough about the importance of meaningfully engaging children and young people in the business of building a better future. But meaningful engagement is more than just asking children and young people what they think about an idea that we, as adults, have come up with. Children and young people are capable contributors and impressive innovators, but we will only reap the benefits of their expertise if we value them and take the time to really hear what they are telling us in their own words and in their own way. We need to shift to an assumption that children and young people know stuff that we need to know, and that we need to talk to them to find out what that is. This requires us to be open to children and young people having views about things that we as adults might not think to be important. We need to allow for children and young people to initiate and direct the pathway of conversation and action. The challenge for adults is to make sure we enter conversations with children and young people without having preconceived ideas about what we might hear, as this can distort the way that we interpret what we are told. As we move forward toward regulating child-safe standards across the country, it's important to recognise that being child-friendly provides an important protective factor and strengthens our ability to be child-safe. In other words, if we provide the space for children and young people to build trust in us, and particularly to trust that we will take what they say seriously, then they are more likely to speak up if they need help. The more we encourage children and young people to be vocal about issues that matter, the more likely it is that children and young people will feel they've been listened to if they raise concerns about things they personally experience. We also have an important responsibility as adults to ensure that the information children and young people have access to is accurate and reliable. If we don't take that responsibility seriously, then it limits the ability of children and young people to understand and develop informed views about a broad range of societal issues, many of which may have direct or indirect impacts on their lives. And if we don't provide the opportunity for children and young people to understand the issues, then we miss the chance to hear what children and young people think and feel about these issues. Last year, as many of you would no doubt remember, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. On that day, I placed my experience in the hands of Year 6 students at a local school. Following an education and brainstorming session that we facilitated between ourselves, my staff, a teacher at the school, the students took ownership and leadership of developing and designing a range of activities to build awareness and understanding about children's rights for their fellow students. Some of the most interesting aspects of the celebration came about in the planning process itself. For example, despite the group initially thinking they would use a handful of rights that they thought were most important, in the course of their planning activities, they came to a shared view that all of the rights were equally important, and that what is important to one child at a particular time may be very different to what is important to another. This nuanced understanding about the often complex interplay that can exist with respect to the enlivening of rights can be best demonstrated through a discussion I had with a young male student on the day itself. This young lad approached me and asked me a question that I can repeat pretty much verbatim, given it was one of those pivotal moments that had me know that children and young people intrinsically get the nuances of the world in which they live. He said, "What happens when rights collide? Like, what if one child's using their right to play while other kids are using their right to learn, and the child who's playing is making it hard for other children to learn?" My first thought, apart from fantastic question, was, damn, missed a key message in my speech this morning. That being the fact that with rights come responsibilities. The discussion that ensued provided a great opportunity to obtain his thoughts about rights existing within context, and how context is often a key consideration in identifying whether one particular right may have precedence over another within that context. Doing so also enabled a reflection on Article 15, which amongst other things, talks about the responsibility to not stop other people from enjoying their rights. The words, actions and inquisitive questions that come from children and young people are only part of the picture they paint for us about their understanding of the world. We need to take the time to understand the message behind these things, because their messages are more often than not nuanced by the unique perspectives they bring by virtue of being children and young people who see and experience the world differently to the way that we do as adults. And if we as adults fail to take an inquisitive active listener role, we may not fully understand what children and young people are telling us. The participation of children and young people in decision-making about issues impacting their lives is not just a nice to have, it's their right, one that we as adults have a responsibility to uphold and protect. In the words of a local ACT child, we have equal thoughts. Don't just think that adults have the big thoughts. Kids have big thoughts too. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jodie, for that. And yes, kids do have lots of big thoughts, and they are experts in their own lives. So thank you for those, sharing that with us. I'd now like to, and we'll be coming back to Jodie after Liana. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce Liana Buchanan. Liana commenced as the Principal Commissioner for Children and Young People in April 2016. Liana has a background in oversight and in system reform for people experiencing disadvantage with a strong focus on family violence and sexual assault. Prior to her appointment as Commissioner, her roles included Executive Officer of the Federation of Community Legal Centres, that was a big job, where she led the peak body for Victoria's 50 community legal centres, and the Director of Correctional Services Review, where she was responsible for monitoring Victoria's correction systems. I've had the pleasure of meeting Liana several times, and her passion and approachability is always so refreshing. So welcome, Liana, and we'll hear from her for 5 minutes about what has been her main focus as Commissioner in Victoria. Thanks, Liana.
Thank you so much, Leesa, and hello to everybody. I can't see, but I know that you're there. I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us, wherever we are in the country, are sitting or standing. I myself am on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my deep respects to the elders past, present, and of course, in Child Protection Week, emerging leaders and elders of that community as well. I'm going to talk a bit in my 5 minutes about really a kind of overview of my take on this topic, with a bit about my particular role as Commissioner, because as many of you will know, the Children's Commissioners and Guardians and Advocates all have slightly different roles. And to varying degrees, I'm sure that our perspectives a bit on children's rights and how well we are delivering against them are probably informed, of course, by what we see in the world around us, but also what we see in our particular role. When I thought about it, I thought probably the easiest way to give you the introduction for what I have to say on this topic is to kind of share what is a fact, which is that many of my speeches, no matter what the topic, include somewhere in them the phrase, "It has been 30 years since Australia ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and yet." Like I say, that phrase, not consciously, but manages to make its way into quite a few of my speeches, no matter what the topic. And in short, I think that's because in many, many ways, we have a long way to go before, as a community, across the country, and in each jurisdiction, I suspect, but of course I'll talk most about Victoria, before we come close to delivering on the rights set out in that convention. Let's remember children's rights didn't kind of start or weren't first conceived of 30 years ago when the United Nations Convention was ratified. The concept, of course, has developed over time. Looking back, again, lots of us know children were absolutely conceived of, certainly in Western cultures, as the property of their parents. They were not independent entities that had any kind of rights or recognition attached to them. That, of course, has developed over time, without getting into kind of boring legal doctrines. There was the kind of initial concept of parens patriae, and the idea that the state has some responsibility in respect of children. And certainly by the early 1900s, we had the emergence of a pretty clear concept that children were beings who were particularly vulnerable, who needed particular protection. And so those early concepts of children's rights, again, lots of you know this, were very much based on the concept that children warranted, needed very particular protection from adults generally, and indeed from the state. So certainly the first Declaration on the Rights of the Child in 1924, that was very much based on the idea that children are inherently vulnerable and fragile. They need that protection. It's a kind of paternalistic concept of rights. And that was still very much what was in the United Nations Declaration in 1959. The concept of children's rights, of course, has developed. And so by the time we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we see those rights to be protected and to have everything that a child needs for healthy development, food, education, safety, healthcare, and so on. We see all of those rights in there. And we also see what we kind of now recognise as more modern rights. Rights that are really kind of ratchet up a notch that notion that children are beings in their own right, that they are and should be recognised as actors in every part of our community, in every part of our world, culturally, economically, socially, and so on. Those are the rights that say children have a right to have a say, they have a right to participate, they have the right to have an influence in the world around us. Now, I kind of set some of that context because based on what I see in my role, I think we struggle even to deliver on those oldest conception of children's rights, the right to protection. In my role as Commissioner, I have a very particular mandate of oversighting what is happening for children involved with child protection, and that includes conducting child death inquiries when a child has died after being involved with child protection. I have a particular oversight role with respect to children in out-of-home care and in youth justice. That means that we get at the Commission every report of serious incidents that happen either in out-of-home care or youth justice. We conduct inquiries either into the way an individual child has been treated or responded to in those settings, or systemic inquiries into kind of broad issues. Of course, we also inspect and visit different residences, different centres, and speak to children and young people in them. Have a whole raft of ways that we do that. Another aspect of my role in Victoria as Commissioner is that I'm the regulator for organisations that work with children in order to prevent the abuse of children in those institutions. So Victoria, I think, is still at the moment, hopefully not for long, the only jurisdiction that has a legislated enforceable child safe standards scheme that applies to some 50 to 60,000 organisations, as well as a reportable conduct scheme. And so those particular roles, again, give me a pretty good insight into not only some of the harms that continue to be done to children in institutional settings, in 3 years of the reportable conduct scheme, I've received almost 5,000 allegations of harm against children in those settings. But also it gives me a pretty good sense about the way children are seen and perceived and treated, and the way that we still, in a lot of organisations, including organisations doing great work, we still have particular set of attitudes and views about children. So based on these functions, as I say, I think we've got a lot of work to do before we even get to kind of first principles around delivering on ensuring that children have in reality have a right to protection and safety. When it comes to some of those more modern concepts of rights, I think we've in some ways barely just begun. The right to agency, the right to have a say, the right to influence. This is not to say that I don't see incredible examples of that. It's not to say I don't see movement. I think absolutely there is a growing recognition, including in government agencies, of the value of children's voice and young people's voice, of the need to include children and young people in different processes.
The cameras seem to be turned off for everyone just at the moment, so let's run with audio just for now, I think.
Okay, then we'll just go with audio. We'll go back to Liana at the moment, and we almost got to, well, you know when you cut off, Liana. Did you have much to go on with?
No, look, thank you. I'll finish with one last point. That was wild, by the way, everybody. It's kind of the equivalent of being on a stage and a trapdoor just kind of opens up underneath you. Lots of fun. The point that I'll end with, because you can kind of tell, and hopefully we'll have the chance to kind of share and exchange kind of views about my dismal assessment of where we're up to in terms of recognising children's rights in the conversation. But I'll finish with this, and really it's about what children and young people have to say and what they recognise about the status that is afforded to them and their voice. Lots of us spend a lot of time talking with children and young people, and certainly during COVID, and in Victoria we're well and truly still in the midst of some of the worst parts of the pandemic. But I've been able to speak directly with about 350 children and young people, as well as many more who've completed surveys. But we've done a really intense process of consultation. And one of the things that has come out incredibly strongly from children and young people is not only how much this is impacting them now, and also how much they know they're going to bear a large part of the burden of the long tail of the kind of social and economic impact of COVID, but also how little they see their issues featured in the public and political debate, and how rare, if not almost non-existent it is, that they see that they are asked to share either their experiences or a view. So they're very, very clear. They're clear about what they've got to offer. They're clear that the status quo is not okay. They're clear that they should be invited to the table more often, and they're clear that they've got a right to be heard. They're pretty clear, I've got to say, and I'll finish with this, they're pretty clear that it's kind of about time for adults and the adult world to simply get on board. Thanks, Leesa.
Thanks, Liana, and I guess thank you for bearing with us while we go from webinar to podcast. There's still a number of people online, so I appreciate you sticking with us on that. Thank you, Liana, for those insights. I think that the theme that both you and Jodie expressed really clearly is that kids have lots of things to say, and they've got a lot of ideas, and we need to be listening to them. One of the things that I am really interested in your take on is children's rights, to some people, it's highly emotive term, and it often leads to that backlash about children having too many rights, or what about the rights of parents? This is pretty unhelpful. Can you give us some examples about how you talk about children's rights in a way that won't disengage people, especially adults around them? Maybe we'll start with you, Jodie.
Yeah, look, I think a large way locally here, as with Victoria, and Liana can no doubt speak to this, you know, we actually have a Human Rights Act here in the ACT, and, you know, I think having that in place is a useful one. It's something that, you know, obviously not everyone's aware of, but certainly a good proportion of the population are aware we have that Human Rights Act. And so quite often for us, I guess, we're contextualising children's rights within that broader human rights space, and talking about the role that that rights have, I guess, in our everyday lives. Look, it's that, you know, children's rights versus parents' rights issue is a vexed one. You know, certainly one of the things we make clear with children and young people is that, you know, with rights come responsibilities. And I think that's an important thing that we all need to recognise. It's not just about children recognising that, you know, it's something that, you know, we don't necessarily talk about in an active way, but it's certainly central to the nature of the way that rights exist. And, you know, I referenced in my opening remarks Article 15, and you know, the fact that within that article it speaks not just about, you know, a particular right that children and young people have, but also speaks to children and young people to have them recognise that issue of, you know, your rights exist within a context whereby you need to be cognizant of not limiting other people's rights, and that's part of your responsibility in doing so. But look, I don't know, I guess, you know, in the way that I talk about it, it's around recognising that, you know, every person is an independent rights bearer, and, you know, for adults as much as for children, you know, we need to recognise that that we operate within that space, and that we need to be cognizant of the rights of others, and that's about balancing. You know, it's not about parents' rights being greater than children's rights, or children's rights being greater than parents' rights. It's about the two of them coexisting side by side, and depending on the context of a particular situation, you know, speaks to which of those rights, or whether there are a combination of rights, I guess, that need to be considered, which is often the case, and usually the case. And those rights might at some different times be in conflict, but, you know, the way we move forward is about seeking to reconcile that conflict and ultimately find a position that, you know, appropriately supports everyone involved.
Thanks, Jodie. Liana, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, certainly. I think it's a in some ways it's a tricky question, or maybe my answer is tricky. Look, there's no question, if I'm going on talkback radio, or I'm speaking to a more conservative audience, be it an individual or a group, then I might couch my arguments and the conversation in a slightly different way. I might not lead with the articulation of children's rights as per Article X of the CRC, and I'd talk more about what I see in terms of children's treatment and the impact that has on children. Whether that's about the failure to kind of engage with a child, about whom there's been a child protection report, which I see a lot in my work. So many situations where children whose experiences I'm reviewing have never actually had a worker go and ask them what's been happening for them and how they feel about it. So whether it's that kind of a scenario, or it's a school setting, or any of the other contexts. Some of the ways to kind of get around the antipathy some people have towards the rights discourse is just by describing what happens for children and young people, what I see of that and the impact it has. But actually, I'm a bit loath to back off too much from naming rights, and from talking about rights, and from talking about why they're important, because I think it's really only by doing that that we'll start to really build a child rights culture. If we keep avoiding the conversation, if we keep buying into it, then arguably the kind of progress I suspect we'd all like to see more of is going to be slower still. So I think you have to be careful about when you do it, and you have to be a bit savvy and strategic, all those words. But the reality is, I think we should be talking more about children's rights, not less. And look, in the kind of parents versus children's rights, or any competing rights kind of context, I mean, there's, you know, the last time, in fact, this came up for me, I'll tell you how I responded. I kind of said, well, you know, if we think we have a child rights approach or acceptance of children as people even in this country, let's look at this. We have laws of reasonable chastisement in, to my knowledge, every jurisdiction, certainly in Victoria. And what that means in practice is that if a person was to physically assault another adult, then that would be a criminal offence. If a person does that to their child, it is not necessarily an offence. So, you know, when you kind of, I think, when you look at some of the incredible disparities between the way that we conceive of and treat, including legally treat children and adults, I think there's a pretty strong argument that we need to talk about rights more, not less.
Thanks, Liana. I guess, as Jodie said, everyone is independent rights bearers, and we need to, I guess, in our work and in our lives, champion the cause of children's rights and stay strong about those. We have had some questions from the audience before the webinar went down. I might just encourage everyone in the audience to still send through their questions. The question function is still working, so it'll be great to hear some more questions and receive some more questions from the audience. But there is a question from the audience, and this is from Jenny. What are some tips or suggestions around hearing young children's voices in COVID? As in Melbourne, we are conducting most visits via video, and there are a lot of barriers to this at the moment, including technical difficulties, as we experienced today, and young children not wanting to speak to a screen and carers controlling a lot of the conversation. That's fairly challenging. Jodie, do you want to start with that?
I think I defer to Liana on this one, given you know, she's right in the midst of it, and you know, I think it's far more prevalent and relevant for Liana.
Can you say happy to do that, Leesa? Can you repeat the very beginning of the question?
Yeah. What are some of the tips or suggestions around hearing young children's voices in COVID? As in Melbourne, we are conducting most visits via video, and there are a lot of barriers to this at the moment, including technical difficulties, young children wanting to speak to the screen, and carers controlling a lot of the conversation. That's from Jenny in the audience.
Thank you, Jenny. That is, it's a fantastic question, and it's a topic that's pretty dear to my heart. I don't know what service or agency you're in, and I don't need to. Part of what I have been pushing gently for since March, since the first set of restrictions, is to try and make sure that we don't too dramatically reduce and stop direct contact. Now, again, it depends a lot on the kind of service you provide and the agency you work in. I'm on the public record saying that I was really concerned, particularly in the early weeks and months, about the extent to which Child Protection changed their service delivery model and pretty dramatically reduced any direct contact. I think it, at a time of heightened risk, it makes it much, much more difficult, this is what you're alluding to engage with adults and certainly with children, and especially young children, and assess what's happening for them, and then and try and resolve those issues. So part of my answer, which won't apply to all types of service, to all types of engagement, of course, because we are trying to stop this virus, and there's very clear Chief Health Officer advice about only essential services continuing. Part of my answer has to be, I think we need to tackle COVID and keep tackling other risks to children. And for me, that means some of our services for children and vulnerable families should have been recognised and treated as essential services from the get-go. Some of that has shifted over time, but not all. And I think because we're in this, frankly, for quite a long time already, and I suspect a fair while still to go, I think we need to keep understanding and adapting our kind of idea around which services are essential to actually have some kind of direct contact. And there's different ways to do. I mean, I've heard in the consultations, I don't want to talk for too long, but I've heard in the consultations I've been doing of services that have used other kind of reasons to attend a family's home to deliver a food package, and they keep their kind of social distancing on the doorstep, and they're kind of wearing, you know, appropriate PPE, and they kind of manage to then kind of just suss out and sound out what's happening in the family. I've heard of a lot of different creative but still safe approaches to this. In terms of the kind of what you really asked, the tips for how you can do it better for very young children, really it is there's no question it's hard to engage online, certainly for any length of time, and you just have to kind of keep persevering and short attempts, trying to find ways to engage with them that isn't overly influenced by their carers, etc. I don't feel like I've got a magic bullet to kind of offer you, because I think what you've heard me say, and what I'll come back to, is where there's really a concern about a child, or really a need to support a child and their family, and there's some concern about what's happening at home, and the fact that carers or others might be around and influencing what that child says. In my view, we've got to find ways around that, ideally, even in the context of the pandemic that we're currently in.
Thanks, Liana. I guess the take home around that is we've got to stay really creative and keep persevering, although there's no one answer. We just have to keep trying the best way that we can in these circumstances. Jodie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think I'd echo many of Liana's comments, and particularly I guess the risks in a situation where children effectively become unseen and unheard are great. And so I would absolutely agree that we need to be making sure that we're finding many varied and creative ways to keep that line of sight to children and young people, and particularly where I guess we know there to be risks or vulnerabilities. Yeah,
absolutely. There are lots of questions coming in from the audience, which is great. So thank you very much for sticking with us. And one of there's a lot of questions coming in about where you've observed child participation not being valued. What has this meant for children and young people in those circumstances? I might start with you, Jodie.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in with that one. I think one of the areas where it most concerns me, and where I certainly don't feel that we see enough child participation taking place is within the care and protection system. And this gets to the heart of, I guess, some of the conversation, or the response to the question that was just had. Some are very good at it, so I'm certainly not trying to lump everyone in the care and protection system into one box. But I think in a situation where we've already got vulnerable children, where they have been removed from families, from their birth families, and are living with either other family units or in residential care or other environments. It's even more integrally important to make sure that we are understanding their experience and knowing what it feels like, what it means for them. Because I guess, I think we have a higher responsibility if in a state or territory a decision is made, to remove a child from their birth family. It kind of raises the bar, and actually it says that government believes that it can look after children better than the birth family can, and I think that's a huge responsibility, and one that needs to be taken extremely seriously. we know, and similar to Liana in her role, I get notifications of a range of different things, and one of those things that I'm notified about is where an abuse in care has occurred. If we're taking a child from a family because, for example, they were either being, directly harmed or, in cases of inadvertent neglect, as in, a parent just not knowing what they need to do to be an effective parent, we have a responsibility to look after them better, not to put them into situations where they are at greater risk. And if we don't have ways to talk to children and young people and to get their views directly about what's happening for them, then we're placing them in a situation of greater risk. So for me, the fact that that child participation isn't uniformly valued in care and protection systems by every single person in that system gives me great cause for concern. I spent Monday afternoon here as part of Child Protection Week with a group of care leavers, ranging in age from 18 to 24. And they spoke about the experiences that they'd had in the care and protection system, and they're blunt and they're brutal, and they were for all of the occasional and they did have good things that had occurred in their lives. They also spoke of times where their views had been actively disregarded. They clearly said in the course of something, when they were called to account or whatever, if you just call so-and-so, if you just do X, then this is going to be easier for us and it's going to be easier for you, and I just think when the system just continues on with the computer says no pathway, what we're doing is compounding the detrimental impacts and the trauma, I guess, that they've already experienced in their lives by not listening to them and understanding where they're coming from and doing something with that. So for me, we need to keep working at that. And again, coming back to Liana's opening remarks, it'd be great to say that we're already there. But if a system like care and protection that is absolutely focused on, acting in the best interests of a child, if that system can't uniformly value child participation in every single interaction they have with a child or young person, or in every single decision they make in respect of a child or young person, then we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie. There's actually a lot of questions coming in around how can you actually value the voices of children and young people in the court proceedings. And I guess that, as you outlined, there's a lot of challenges around that, but are there certain things that practitioners can do? I mean, it's an adversarial system by nature, but what can we do so that we can ensure that children's rights are not lost and they are heard and they're well presented? Liana, can I get you to respond to that?
Yeah, Leesa, sorry, there's a bit of a sound issue. Can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of questions coming through about court being less than an ideal situation and quite adversarial to hear the children's voices and their rights. And it often feels like they're lost in those children's court proceedings or the family law court proceedings. What are your particular thoughts on how we can continue to advocate for the rights of children and their voices subject to court proceedings? That's from Kirsty.
So I feel very clear that it's the obligation of every participant, certainly every participant who's purporting to act in the child's best interests, or whose role is to make a determination, that it is their obligation to be very, very clear about what that child says and wants, and how that child describes their own experiences. Now, I could go into discussions of different types of representation for children in different proceedings. I won't do that. It doesn't serve today's purpose. But if we're talking about care and protection proceedings, then like Jodie, I have done a lot of work, the Commission has done a lot of work looking at and hearing from children and young people, as well as examining files, etc., looking at all the barriers that prevent children from being heard and indeed often from being asked and engaged with. And there are many, many systemic factors that contribute to that in terms of the pressure on the system and on workers in the system. So it's not only about culture and practice, it's also about a whole raft of pressures. But we're not going to get children's voices articulated and referenced through the court process if the people whose role it is to engage with them in the first place and assess what's happening for them are not engaging with them. So that's where part of the answer. And then, I mean, I think the question referred to an adversarial approach in the courts. I've said this before. As you alluded to, Leesa, I have a legal background. The child protection jurisdiction is quite a unique jurisdiction in terms of how intensely adversarial it is, not in terms of the court process, not the legal process itself, but the attitudes and feelings that I think different participants have towards each other. So I continue to be really dismayed about that, because I think it's pretty hard to have a system, even a court kind of based adversarial system, working effectively when there's a high level of antagonism between different parts of the system. I think certainly in Victoria and elsewhere, I think we need to work on that and overcome that. But we need to keep looking at kind of other ways for children's voices and views to be heard through the court process. At its simplest, though, we need every person involved in that process to have a focus on the child and what the child is saying and wanting, as well as what's in their best interest. But there's a kind of cultural shift there that I think needs to happen as well.
Thank you, Liana. Yes, I think that we as practitioners in those settings, we all just need to keep doing our best to make sure that we keep children's voices and their views at the centre of everything. And thank you, Kirsty. I used to work with Kirsty. Hello, Kirsty. Another question from the audience. Can you tell us about some of the best examples you've seen of organisations listening to and being responsive to the views of children? Like, what are we doing really well out there? Some key lessons from organisations that we can learn from. This is from Dave from the audience. I'll get you to start with that, Liana.
Hi, yes. Look, I won't name, partly because I'm a regulator, I won't name particular organisations, but I'll talk a bit more broadly. We have, as I said at the outset, we have legislated child safe standards in Victoria. At the moment, they're a bit different from the National Child Safe Principles because they predated the Royal Commission's final report and those principles, but I think over time the Victorian government will line those up. But one of the really important parts of the standards, and indeed the National Child Safe Principles, is that they reference children's rights to participate. And certainly for the Victorian Child Safe Standards, one of our 7 standards is that organisations that work with children, that have contact with children, must have strategies to empower children. So we don't just talk about giving them a say, we talk about organisations must have strategies to empower children. So through that work, you'll have gathered from my introduction, I see many, many organisations that struggle enormously with that, and probably if it's the standard that I think is least progressed in many agencies, it's that one. That said, it also means I get to see a whole range of different organisations, from little volunteer-run AusKick clubs through to schools, through to different child and family service agencies, the whole raft, childcare centres that have done incredible work to build children's participation. So that takes so many different forms. It means having child advisory committees, It means having different kind of focus groups on different topics. It means whenever there's a decision for some that needs to be made that is a significant decision, there'll be a process of engaging and consulting with children and young people. Really, the organisations where I see this working well have built into their kind of DNA a question about, okay, we're going to take an action, make a decision, review an approach. How will we best include children and understand what they're telling us? And they're the organisations that do that well. So there's a gazillion different techniques and strategies that they use to do that. But really, the common element for those organisations is that it's kind of just a part of their core way of working. That they think, okay, how are we going to get children and young people's involvement in this whatever piece of work they're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Liana. Did you want to add anything to that, Jodie?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, just waiting for the unmuting. Yeah, look, I think I'd agree again with Liana. I think many people understand it theoretically, but don't necessarily know practically how to apply that. And, you know, for example, within organisational governance structures, what might that look like? And I was reflecting, thinking a bit while Liana was talking about the research that ACU undertook as part of the Royal Commission. And one of the things that that really struck me out of that research was the understanding that they drew about the difference, the clear distinction, I guess, that children and young people make between what adults might think to be important structures, important strategies to enable a child or young person to be safe, versus what children and young people intrinsically know to be important in helping them feel safe. And I think it's, you know, part of the rationale, I guess, for the development of the child safe standards, really, and in particular the standard that Liana referenced about involving children and young people in decision making, comes off the back of that, and that important role that, again, as I said in my introduction, that participation plays in protection. But I, you know, the participation stuff, it can be relatively simple if organisations are prepared to engage. You know, being willing to bringing children and young people in the tent, so to speak, into the decision-making tent, is the deal breaker. And I think if that willingness is there, then it starts opening up. You know, I think it's about organisations thinking about the different ways that children and young people can be involved in decision making. Where does, think about where does their decision making happen? What are the structures? What are the mechanisms, the processes by which they make decisions in their organisation? And how can they bring children and young people into those? Or alternatively, if that's a challenge to do so, well, then can you create new mechanisms? Are there new processes that they can design that deliberately involve children and young people in decision making? And that echoes, I guess, Liana's views there about it's when you start thinking about it, it can be really simple, and it can. At a bare minimum, it might be about having an annual survey or a quarterly survey or something like that, where you're actually asking kids, are we doing what we do well or not? As you get more deeply into it, there are so many different ways, beyond the, standard survey, that we can connect children and young people to decision-making processes. And it's just about, being a bit creative, being willing, I guess, to step outside the box. As I said, it doesn't need to be hard. And I think that's, for some, I think we kind of, we overthink it. And I think that's the stuff that gets in the way sometimes. Unfortunately, it's just the fact that we've overthought it and made it out to be, so much harder than it actually needs to be.
Thanks, Jodie. I think that we've seen examples of lots of organisations trying to really engage the voices of children, especially over the last few years. And I have definitely seen a lot more youth reference groups. But how can we engage a cross-section of youth, not just the highly articulated youth or children? How can have you got any tips, Liana or Jodie, about how we can make those youth groups or those children's groups that people might be setting up a greater representation of a broader cross-section of children and young people? I'll leave that with you firstly, Jodie, then we'll ask Liana.
Yeah, thanks, Leesa. Look, I think being aware of the diversity that exists within your organisation is the first step. You know, if you know that you have a diverse cohort of children and young people, which you will have, that's the nature of our world, you know, then I think recognising that, but and consciously deciding and seeking to make sure, I guess, that diversity, that broad cross section is captured in any process that you're putting in play. You know, certainly one of the things that you know, we seek to do when we're doing any consultation, if we're, you know, doing that with a school or doing that with a local organisation, you know, youth serving or child serving organisation, you know, but particularly in the school setting, we will actually, you know, without saying it in these words necessarily, but we'll say to whoever's helping us organise that at the school, you know, we don't want to just hear from the best and the brightest. You know, we want, you know, the whole spectrum. You know, we don't want, you know, the same group that you go to about everything being the group that, you know, we engage with. And, you know, we'll usually try to do that by saying, you know, hey, how about you just link us in with a couple of different class groups, because that diversity is going to be present within a class group. So, you know, it's, again, I think it's about just having a level of mindfulness in the way that you put together any process by which you're seeking to understand children and young people's views. And to very deliberately, you know, have a look at those who are, you know, not just go to the ones who might put their hands up as children and young people and say, yes, I want to be involved, but actually look for ways to engage those who might not necessarily put their own hands up, or who might not necessarily be nominated by someone else. And, you know, I think that in and of itself it needs to be part of the process, I guess, the process of deciding how are we going to get the views of children and young people, and how are we going to make sure that appropriately represents that diversity.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, Liana, I'll get you to pick that up. And I guess it's also about saying, how can we make young people actually feel heard rather than just being consulted? So I'd be interested in your thoughts around that.
Sure, thanks, Leesa. So on the first question, I kind of following everything that Jodie says, which I agree, you know, the starting point is consciousness. I mean, I don't have any magic strategies. I think if I reflect on the process that we've just recently been through at the Commission, we kind of worked pretty hard. And if I think about what we normally do when we're looking to very kind of heavily engage with or share some power and influence with children and young people, then it takes a bit of work and a bit of thoughtfulness. It's about where are some of the children and young people who might be less likely to put up their hands for a whole raft of reasons. Where are they likely to be connected into? And so, you know, this has got all about, you know, my colleagues and staff at the Commission. We work pretty hard to work out which are the agencies, which are the organisations, which are the groups that might be connected with these children and young people, where those children and young people already have some source of support, or at least have in the past. So we'll go to different youth services, different drug and alcohol services, different at-home care services, really trying to kind of work with schools, flexible learning centres and so on, really any kind of organisations that have contact with a diverse group of people, as well as other organisations that also have contact with a diverse group of people, but might be a kind of cohort of young people who haven't experienced the same level of disadvantage. So I think it is about consciousness, as Jodie says, and it's about working pretty hard at it. The question, I think, was premised around if you're having a youth advisory group, how do you get good representation? And I think that's probably part of not the problem, but I think if we are just whether we're a commission or a community service organisation or a local council, if we're only relying on a youth advisory group to support children and young people's voice and participation, we're going to be missing the mark. So yes, absolutely, have a youth advisory group, but get them very actively involved with you in building what you do, designing what you do, designing how you're going to engage with children and young people. But the actual engagement and the kind of contact has to be broader than that. You're never going to get a fully representative group on a single body. Then the question about how to, I think I'm paraphrasing, but how to make sure the consultation or the engagement isn't tokenistic and doesn't feel tokenistic. And that's really, again, there's a whole spectrum of engagement, right? There is just consultation. We're going to come and we'll hear from you and we'll take that away, right through to genuine power sharing, genuine kind of, okay, here's a decision that we have to make. We the adult, we the organisation, whatever the we is, and we're actually going to involve you actively in making that decision. And so I think just understanding that spectrum, being very clear about where in that spectrum you want to kind of position whatever you're doing, where you can, so there'll be some limits. There's some limits, for example, some limits to the kind of power or decision-making responsibility I can share with children and young people when it comes to some of my statutory responsibilities, but there's a whole lot of other points along the way that I can kind of recognise, actually, I'm making some decisions here that impact children and young people, and I need to kind of at least give them some role in that decision. So that's part of it, understanding that there's that whole spectrum and being very clear with yourself and then with the children and young people with whom you're engaging about where you're positioning there. And then there's very fundamental things, Leesa, of course, that if you're consulting, then you go back to children and young people. Here's what we heard and here's what we've done with it. Or if you're including young people in a decision-making process, then again, you're very clear with those children and young people, whether it's a small group or it's hundreds, you've got a feedback mechanism to say, here's what we've done with your information, here's the decision, here's how you shaped it. So that's all, pretty basic, but easily gets lost because, of course, we're all very busy and we're not used to doing this necessarily.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, Liana. We've got to keep children informed across the whole process. So it's not just, I guess we've got to be careful not just to do that consulting, but let them know really clearly where those consultations have ended up and how they've impacted any decision making that might have come about from that. I'm really grateful that everyone stayed online to NAPCAN's first podcast. And we've still got quite a few questions from the audience. So I'll just ask you a few more. This is from Leah from the audience, especially, and we've talked about it a little bit before, but especially with primary school age children. We've talked a lot about how we engage youth, but it's a little bit harder to engage younger children and, primary school children or younger children. How do we actually do that really well and meaningfully? And have you got any great tips or advice for the attendees? I'll start with you, Jodie.
Great, thank you. Again, I'd say, it doesn't have to be difficult. And, some of the stuff that we've done, we've engaged with, preschoolers, 3 and 4-year-olds about different issues. And, certainly primary school is a space where we're quite often invited in to either undertake consultations or to create a space for conversations about children's rights, as, where it fits into the curriculum, usually at about year 2, I think it is, and year 5 or 6. It's about tailoring, it's about using different tools and techniques. Obviously the younger a child, and certainly as we get down to the the preschool age, it's about using different play opportunities to create a space for engagement. And last year, I think it was, ahead of one of our national meetings of the Australian New Zealand Children's Commissioners and Guardians, we developed a survey that we pushed out nationally, asking children and young people what they thought was important, and things that we should be looking at as children's commissioners and guardians. And locally here, there were a couple of preschool providers early childhood centres that actually said, we really want to actually ask our class groups these questions and have them engage with this. And have you got any ideas on how to do that? And some of the stuff was, one, simplifying the questions, because we had posed them, I guess, at a level of, where kids would independently be getting on to undertake the survey. So, we reworked the questions, put them into simple language, but just went and actually sat down pretty much on the ground and had a couple of different, play activities set up where we, used those play activities to provide the context for the questions, and then just kind of talked it through. And, we went off on tangents and different segues and, into places that we never thought we'd go. And I think that's the stuff we need to be open to. If we are honestly wanting to hear what's important to children and young people, regardless of age, then at some level we've got to let the kids set make the ground rules, and to guide and direct the conversation according to what they're looking and are interested in telling us, rather than us coming in and again, it's something I said in my opening, and asking kids about an idea that we've decided is important as adults. But, practically with any consultation, it's about designing it in a way that that fits the age group, that fits the cohort, that, responds to the socio-demographic variables or whatever it might be, that can influence whether a child or a young person even feels sufficiently comfortable to even just speak in the first place. But, I don't know, there's so many different things you can start talking about in terms of creating a space for a consultation with kids. But, environment is important. How you set up the environment is important. We always have heaps of, fidget toys and, tactile things that kids can, pick up and play with, even while, it might be talking about something. We'll have the front end icebreakers, but then a range of other different activities that we use to actually unpack the questions, I guess, that we're asking. And there's no, and I think Liana said it earlier, there's no magic wand for this. It's about carrying in a toolbox, and working out which tools are going to best unlock, I guess, the puzzle that you're grappling with.
Yeah, I agree. The toolbox is a good analogy, and I think having a plan B, C or D, because ultimately we might have ideas as adults that we think children want to talk about these things, but I guess asking them what they want to talk about is a really great start. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything to that, Liana.
No, look, nothing particular. Just, I think Jodie's said it really, really clearly and really well. I think we certainly do a lot of engagement with younger children, and it is about making sure that you take their age and where they're at in terms of stage of development into account when you're kind of choosing the setting, you're describing what you're doing, you're kind of framing the questions and so on. But also, again, just remember not to assume what they'll understand or what they'll want to talk about. Again, in the COVID-related engagement that we've been doing, we spoke to a significant number of primary school children, and some of what we got from them, some of what they told me was it was heartbreaking, but also so insightful. So they were really clear about how anxious they were about the risk of COVID, really clear about what worried them, about their family, about their grandparents, really clear about what was hard during remote learning and what they kind of wish their teachers had been able to do differently and so on. So, I think it's always easy to underestimate, and we should always guard against that.
Thanks, Liana. I think it is really easy to underestimate children and their voices. I know that we've gone out thinking that we would be talking to young children or young people about a certain thing, and it's completely different because that's not what they want to talk about. So I think that flexibility is really important when talking with children or young people. We've got a lot of, probably this will be the last question from the audience. There's a lot of questions about Any suggestions that you might have for organisations on how to ensure that young people leaving care have their rights upheld to support them to reach their full potential in society after being in care? And that was from Leesa. I might get you to start with that, Liana, if you can, please.
Okay. So we at the Victorian Commission are towards the end, in fact, of a major inquiry into the experience of children and young people, both in terms of preparation for leaving care and then post-care. So there's a lot I could say. The question was quite specific about what can be done to support young people, and you know, I have to say it, part of the answer, and again, I'll talk about Victoria, but unfortunately, I don't think the situation is that different in other parts of the country. Part of the answer has to be in improving young people, children and young people's experience in care. So what we know in Victoria, and we did another big inquiry on this last year, in an inquiry called In Our Own Words, we know that placement instability, multiple placement moves, we know that for some, certainly residential care, significant lack of safety in care is a problem. We know that children and young people describe their experience in care of really having no control over what's happening for them and no sense of a say, and often not even getting an explanation for what's happening to them. So all of those experiences, particularly experiences around instability in placement, they're big systemic problems that we have to tackle, but we have to tackle those if we're going to hope to improve how ready children and young people are to leave care or to transition to independence. There's very particular things. So if I think about the work that we've been doing, yes, of course, we're looking at all of the pretty troubling outcomes for young care leavers. I was setting all of that out in the inquiry. But we've also looked really closely at, even though we don't have a provision for all children, all young people to remain supported by the care system until 21, as many are advocating for. We don't have that yet. But there are a lot of things that are meant to be happening for young people in care and young people who've left care now. What we've found in our inquiry, looking in a huge amount of detail at files, talking to workers, talking to young people, there's a lot of that transition planning either isn't happening, or if it is, it's not really going to the heart of what young people care about and want. So it's often, again, probably for lots of issues that are connected with system under pressure, it's often very checklist, kind of tick a flick. It's not happening until very, very close to when a young person is leaving care, so it's happening too late. And importantly, it doesn't seem to be informed. Based on what we can ascertain, it seems rarely to be informed by a real conversation with that young person around both what they're worried about, but also their aspirations. So that real engagement about where are you at, where do you want to be at in 2 years' time, and what do we really need to do to support you to get there, that's missing. And partly that's missing because often it's just about trying to find somewhere for that young person to live, or trying to make sure that they have the appropriate referrals for Centrelink. So there's kind of very pressing needs, but they're being addressed far too late, frankly, and that means that the kind of more fundamental conversations that any young person deserves being a part of as they plan transition to adulthood, they're not happening, and we've got to build those into the way we work with those young people, and then those conversations with the young person's views and dreams and aspirations, as well as their deep concerns, all of that needs to be central to the work and support that then is ideally put around them to support them going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Liana. I think it's definitely a space to watch across the nation, and I think that we're going to see a lot, and hopefully we'll see a lot of changes in the leaving care legislation. Jodie, did you want to add anything in there from an ACT perspective?
You know, as with Liana, I think the starting early is just so important. You know, I think there's a tendency for some to leave it to the last minute, and I don't think if you think about the process of learning that we all go through as children and young people, it's an iterative one. And, if you were fortunate to be able to remain in your biological family home, your parents spend time and equip you, and they don't push you out of the nest until you're ready, and all those sort of things, and it's about both being practically ready as well as being emotionally ready. And I know Liana spoke to both of those elements, and asking the young people what do they need, and I think knowing and understanding what they're aiming for and helping them identify the pathway to getting there. But again, with the young group of care leaders I spoke to on Monday, one of them raised, and it's just these things that we forget that they're not, or we make assumptions, I guess, about what young people understand. And one of the young guys was talking about he'd been fortunate to secure housing, which was great. But 2 months in, or it was 2 or 3 months in, I can't remember now, no one had actually told him about the need to hook up electricity and, set up an electricity account. No one had told him about the need to set up a water and sewage account. And, it was just absolutely by luck that he didn't have his electricity turned off, or conversely, find himself with a whopping great bill 6 months or 12 months down the track that he wouldn't have been able to afford, and would therefore be at risk of losing his tenancy. It's those little, or seemingly little things, that we need to focus on and make sure young people have an understanding about. And I think we perhaps, or the system perhaps, makes too many assumptions about what kids know and understand, rather than actually making a conscious effort to walk them through, talk them through, build and develop that understanding. And if we were doing that about the practical things, I think what we would find out in that process are also where the emotional supports are needed, and where some of those, less practical and more person responsive and individualized supports are needed. So I think you can start with the practical, and I think the other stuff will come as you build that trust with the young person that you're there to help them. But I think the cutoff issue of when that support's not there anymore is you got to plan for that as well, because our systems, as Liana's rightly pointed out, don't cater for ongoing support. They cater for a cutoff at 21 or, whatever it might be. And in some jurisdictions, I think it's still, not 18, 19 kind of stuff, rather than recognising that all of us need support every day as adults. We seek out different people to help us with different aspects of decision making in our lives. Young people, young care leavers, equally need to have those avenues that they can go to for the different areas that they might need support in their lives, particularly in those early years after just leaving care.
Yeah, thank you, Jodie. I think they're really informative response. I think our time has actually flown by. I just want to get both of you to leave the audience with one final thought or one final tip. There's lots more questions that have come through, but you could just maybe share your last final thought, final tip. I'll start with you, Liana.
Put me on the spot, Leesa. Look, the last thing that I would leave people with is just a bit of a call. And look, if people joined into this webinar, we're probably preaching to the converted. But keep up the conversation about children's rights. Keep up not just the conversation, but the action and the creative ideas. And innovation around how to make sure that we give children and young people voice and influence, and that we kind of consider sharing power, whatever that looks like when we can. Just keep it up. I mean, again, I think people who've participated today are already on board with the importance of this. But we really do. I guess I would say this. I think we do not have a child rights culture in Australia, and until we do, we're really going to still see a lot of the problems Jodie and I have described, a lot of the problems that you all see and part of shifting how we see children has to be about kind of shifting that discussion on child rights, and then shifting the way we treat children and young people accordingly. So keep it up, and if anything, amplify that.
Thank you, Liana. And Jodie, something to finish on?
I think I might finish with a quote, another quote. I like using and making sure, I guess, that the words we hear from children and young people are given the opportunity to guide us. And this particular one comes from a recent consultation we undertook with young people who have a lived experience of family violence. And there was one particular quote that really struck me, and it was a young person who was asked, what advice he would provide to other young people in similar situations. And he said, there's always that one person I've noticed that's warm-hearted, that you'll know, that you'll pick up on immediately. Talk to them. Keep going until you find that one warm heart. And I think that would be my advice to everyone on the line is, be that one warm heart.
Oh, thank you, Jodie. That's a great thing to finish with. So I guess in wrapping up, we don't have as Liana said, we don't have a child rights culture in Australia yet. Even if it is 30 years on from when the UNCROC was ratified, and we've still got children's commissioners saying, finishing some of those conversations with not yet, we've got a long way to go. We can all, and I agree with Liana, we are probably preaching to the converted. I've seen a lot of my former colleagues online, which is nice to see, and I know that they are the converted. So I guess we keep fighting the good fight and remember that children are experts in their own lives, and that we need to give them time and be flexible in how we include them in the decisions that matter to them. I'm not really sure how this will be sent out to everyone. We were recording the initial podcast in the initial webinar, and I think we're recording this. So we will send out a copy of that, and there's still lots of questions from the audience that we haven't had answered. So I will send some of those through to Liana and Jodie, and we will send those out to you in due course. Thank you so much for persevering with us, and I know that behind the scenes some of my colleagues are saying they really like the podcast, so you can say you were part of NAPCAN's first. Thank you for fitting us into your day. Thank you so much, Liana and Jodie. What great panelists you were, and thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us. We might see you in the next webinar. There's webinars with some of the other children's commissioners. Thank you both.
Thanks, Leesa.